Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching The Naturalist Capitalist. I'm your host, Reed Coverdale. And for the second of hopefully many appearances, we've got Scott Horton back on the show again. How you doing, Scott?
I'm doing great, Reed. Thanks for having me, buddy.
Yeah, no problem. Last time I had you on, we talked about Tulsi Gabbard, Rand Paul, and Justin Amash, and how no one really calls out the war on terror like Ron Paul did. And the Rand Paul guys and the Justin Amash guys, you know, they're whatever. They're not like super protective, but the Tulsi Gabbard supporters, rightfully so, they're very defensive about anything you say about her just because she's been so, you know, vilified by the media and everything.
Fair
but
enough, sure.
That was the first time that I got a lot of messages and a lot of comments saying, wow, this guy is critiquing her from a standpoint of, you know, absolutism and, you know, a high standard of, you know, just the truth. And I didn't really get much backlash. So that was cool to see because I don't see that very often. So you're doing good work, man.
Yeah, I'll take that. I saw where one person said, I'm not sure actually. I think it was either on Twitter or on YouTube comments or something. I saw someone brought up that, where did she say that there are hundreds of these Al-Qaeda groups to fight? That's a fair question because they might not have heard her say that. And I forget if in the speech, it was, I guess someone on Twitter was reacting against the clip of the speech I gave at the Ron Paul event where I talked about her in 2019. I guess it was. Yeah. And that was a YouTube video that she had put out, a campaign video that she put out where she named, look, we have Al-Qaeda in the Idlib province, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We have Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Now we're already getting pretty broad in our definition. Al-Shabaab are not real Al-Qaeda. They pretend to be every once in a while when they collect a sack of dollar bills from the Saudis, but that's it. They're not really. In fact, their most internationalist terrorist leader was killed back in 2013. Go Dane. So anyway, so she's already getting carried away here, right? Well, we got them in Idlib and we got them in Yemen and we got them in Somalia. And then she just breaks. She might have said, possibly she said Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa there, but very quickly she breaks into, there are hundreds of these groups spread throughout North Africa and the Middle East, et cetera, however exactly she phrased it. And that's just not the case. And with a loophole like that, you know, Bush, when he launched the terror war, said that we have these terrorist enemies are in 60 countries. Well, I mean, these are not nation states with police forces. I mean, what do you mean there are 60 countries with Al-Qaeda guys in them that are wanted for anything? Or what are we talking about here, right? So now there are hundreds of these groups. Where could they possibly be when virtually the entire world is covered in nation states with severe monopolies on force, you know, who don't even pretend to be democratic in figuring out who gets to wield the power. So it was a huge exaggeration on Bush's part then, although it's a hell of a lot more true now than it was when he said it. But it's still miles and miles from 100 type groups. I mean, and her attitude, and I understand, and for people who aren't familiar, based on my case on Gabbard is that she was great on Syria, but Syria was just crazy.
Right.
And what she essentially had a hawkish but sane position versus a hawkish and completely crazy fighting on the wrong side of the war position, right? But her position anyway should be that when it does come to the war against bin Ladenites, that even that, we need to be ramping that down. We need to be figuring out how to end that, because she would have to admit even that, look, you give Bush, Obama, or Trump a wanted dead or alive poster for one guy, and they'll kill 2 million people. And they'll attack secular regime after secular regime. And so if you let them have a terror war at all, they'll do whatever they want with it. So if she was the president and she's going to have a terror war. She better end it in 4 years. She better figure out a way to call the thing off so that she's not going to leave it ongoing to her successor, because then he's going to go and attack the Shiites or attack another general, with a clean shaven chin, like these guys are so apt to do. And so, but you know what? I do like her and I do respect her. And I got her PO box and I sent her a book, or actually, I guess I'm going to send her a book tomorrow. I'm working on the signing and the wrapping up of the book. So tomorrow, between interviews, I'm going to hit the post office and she'll be getting one. And, I definitely give her credit for, giving a shit at all. Most of these people don't at all, and as I said, I respect the fact that her opinion on Syria comes from experiencing, not that she was pulling triggers in combat, but she is, like, I guess technically considered a combat veteran, having driven on the highway between Baghdad and Balad Air Base over and over again, and get, mortars coming over the walls, and on a medical unit dealing with maimed and dying and wounded soldiers, blood everywhere. That was her experience, at least one of her tours over there. The second one, she was in Kuwait, which I think was still pretty bad. She's on a medical unit, and dudes are getting flown down there, missing their limbs and their manhood and their God knows what, so she had a hell of a time in that war. For them to ask her to support Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria, like, oh, that's okay as long as it's in Syria,
Right?
Insane. For them to call her, oh, she's an apologist for Assad because she won't support Ayman al-Zawahiri against him. Yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah. I want to get into that. So let's do Syria for dummies, because
Okay.
I know a little bit more than most people, but some people who watch this probably won't. So most of the blame goes on Obama, but it actually starts with Bush, right? Like in 2006, because we ended up supporting the allies of Iran in power in Iraq, and so that wasn't good enough. So you want to just give us the lowdown on how Bush screwed up, and then he decided he had to, throw everything in 2006 and try to basically reform his mistake?
Sure. Well, I'm glad you asked me such a broad question so early in the interview. This is going to take the rest of the hour. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. It's like this, man. It was the neoconservatives who lied us into that war. And they did it for Israel. That was why. Okay. Richard Pearl, David Wormser, Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith. These guys were on a mission. Okay. Now, Bush had his reasons. And I talk about this in the book. Cheney and Rumsfeld had their reasons too. But it was the neocons who said, one, we have to do this. And two, don't worry, it's going to be great. And they were the ones who had the monopoly on the entire, media echo chamber and the think tank consensus in the run up to that war. They're the ones who made it happen. Why? Just to say for Israel doesn't explain it. Okay. Here's the explanation. It's really stupid. All right. It goes like this. Hezbollah, this Shiite mini state in southern Lebanon, which grew up as a militia, which, yes, used terrorist tactics as well in resistance to the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon in the 80s and 1990s, when it is now basically a mini government of its own and a coalition partner in the ruling government in Beirut, has essentially a constantly growing missile force and infantry force, which is really not good for invading Israel, but is a hell of a deterrent to keep Israel out and limits their freedom of action, as they put it, in Lebanon. Okay. So in the 1990s, Bush Sr. and then Bill Clinton had pushed really hard to get the Oslo Accords passed. And this was the beginning of the peace process, as they called it, toward the creation of an independent Palestinian state for the Palestinians who had been previously occupied by Jordan, but at this point had been occupied by the Israelis in the West Bank and then also in the Gaza Strip since 1967. And then based on Israel giving up the West Bank and Gaza Strip for the Palestinians to have as their state, then that would create peace with the neighbors, etc. And the neoconservatives, the guy in charge of trying to implement that policy was Yitzhak Rabin, and he was assassinated by an Israeli settler on the West Bank. So then Perez comes in, and shortly after that, Benjamin Netanyahu is the new prime minister of Israel in 1996. At this point, David Wurmser and Richard Perle, two extremely important neoconservatives who served in the Bush government later on, wrote a piece, a paper for him, for an Israeli think tank meant to be advice for Netanyahu, called A Clean Break, a new strategy for securing the realm. And it said, forget land for peace and forget peaceful coexistence with our neighbors. We need new strength, dominant strength, and we'll have peace through dominance, and no one will ever mess with us because we'll be so much more powerful than them. There's no point in trying to come to an understanding with anybody. And by the way, we want the West Bank. Gaza, they don't care so much. But the West Bank, why? We want to steal that land. And so we don't want to make a deal where we have to give up that land to have peace with the neighbors and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to eschew all of that. And we're going to make a clean break with Oslo and all of this. And we're going to have this new policy based on Israeli strength. But here's our problem. Iran uses Syria to arm Hezbollah. And we want to break that chain. And so to break that chain, we should focus first on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. Well, what the hell? Break out a map. You can see that Sunni Saddam is the roadblock between Iran, Syria, and southern Lebanon. So how is getting rid of Saddam Hussein supposed to help the situation? Well, according to these idiots, what we're going to do is we'll do a coup. They weren't planning a war at this time. They didn't think they could have one. So they said, Bill Clinton was about to be reelected and they knew it. They said, what we'll do is we'll have some kind of coup. We'll figure out how to overthrow him. And then we'll make the cousin, first the king of Jordan, and then later his cousin, the king of Iraq. And these are the Hashemites who had been, placed in power in Jordan by the British and had a king in Iraq from after the end of the First World War for 10 years or 20 years before they killed him. It didn't last that long, but they had a Hashemite king previously under, as a British sock puppet, I guess, between the world wars. And so the neoconservatives said, what'll happen is we'll have this Hashemite king will come in and he'll rule Baghdad. And I know what you're saying. Okay, fine. So the Sunnis will go along with that. I guess if they'll go along with Saddam Hussein, they'll go along with the king to replace him. But what about the Shiites? The Shiite Arabs in Iraq are the super majority. And how are they supposed to deal with this? And David Wurmser said, don't worry, it'll be fine. Because my friend Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, who's trying to convince me to convince you to do this, he says that the Shiites, they just love being told what to do, especially by a guy who claims to be the descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And since the Hashemite family line claims to be the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, the Shiites will do whatever he says. And so then what we'll do is he will order them not just to be nice and compliant, but in fact, he will order the Shiite religious leadership in Najaf to intervene with Hezbollah and order Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to stop listening to the Iranian Ayatollahs and start listening to the Iraqi ones who are now will be under the thumb of the Jordanian king and therefore the servants of the will of the United States and Israel. What could go wrong, right? This whole thing is completely stupid. The Shiites don't revere the Hashemites at all in any way, any more than you do, okay? And for the family line of Muhammad that they do revere, it has nothing to do with the Hashemites, and it does not translate to total obedience in a political sense anyway. There are times when, say, for example, the Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq will make a religious proclamation that has, significant political importance, but it's never in a vacuum. And it's never telling people something opposite of what they need to hear or want to hear. So, for example, he said, hey, if you're a Shiite and you believe in God, I want you to go outside and tell George Bush you want one man, one vote. They obeyed that, right? But if he had told them, obey this Hashemite king from Jordan telling you to sacrifice your own interests, to go against your own interests, they would have laughed. That'd have been the same as the Ayatollah told you, Reed, what to do. Don't care. The Saudi king or the Jordanian king told you what to do. Can't, no authority over me whatsoever. And so this whole thing was just complete idiocy, but that's what they believed. And they wrote, Wormser wrote 2 papers and a book about it. A Clean Break, Coping with Crumbling States. And then the book is called Tyranny's Ally, which is just the long version of A Clean Break. It's the same harebrained scheme in longer form. And this is what Ahmed Chalabi, who was the leader of the Iraqi exiles, convinced the neoconservatives that essentially this new kingdom will be friends with the Israelis. They'll, Saddam Hussein sends condolence payments, so-called, to, or I don't know what they call them exactly, but payments to, I'm sorry, did you say something?
No.
Oh,
yeah.
I thought I heard something. It's probably outside. It's part of my own echo. Saddam Hussein would send money to the family of any Palestinian who died, pardon me, in conflict with the Israelis. So that included suicide bombers, or included a little old lady who got ran over by an Israeli bulldozer. Her family would get a check from Saddam Hussein, but it also meant a suicide bomber who blew up a pizza parlor full of Israeli civilians. His family would get a check from Saddam Hussein too. And the neoconservatives barely ever talked about this in public. They did talk about it kind of in smaller audiences, that this is one of the major reasons for their motivation for wanting to do this war and their resentment against him. And then Chalabi was promising that all that was going to go away, and that in fact we'll build a water and a oil pipeline to Haifa. And I quote in the book, pardon anybody's sensitive ears, but it's a direct quote. I'm not saying this. I'm just saying, I'm quoting another guy talking to an important journalist from the Financial Times named John Dizard. Talked to a Jordanian associate of Chalabi who says something very close to, I was really concerned that Ahmed Chalabi is hanging out. And I asked him, what are you doing with all of these guys? And Chalabi told me, don't worry, I'm just using these Jews to get what I want. And then I'm going to stab them in the back and betray them in the end. And then I said, oh, that's a relief. Thank goodness, Ahmed, or whatever. This is the direct quote. This isn't me. This is what Chalabi told his friends he was doing. I'm lying to these American neoconservatives, these Israel first neoconservatives, out of power in the 90s, in the Bush government, ensconced in the vice president's office, the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Defense Department in the W. Bush years, especially the first term, in order to get this war done. And then when he was confronted, this is the guy who furnished all the witnesses promising you're going to find all these weapons of mass destruction and everything. And when they asked him later, he said, oh, well, I guess we're just heroes in error. Sorry about that. Not too sorry. And then, of course, Iran, not America, were the major beneficiaries. And so instead of using the Iraqi Shiite religious clergy to break Hezbollah away from Iran, they all essentially became even more under the sway of Iran. And so the Shiite parties who had taken Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war and had fled to Iran and had been living in Iran for 23 years by the time Bush invaded, they came right in on the heels of the American invasion. And they were the ones who supported it. As I said, the Ayatollah Sistani, it was in January 2004. So it was, just shy of a year into the war. The Ayatollah said, if you believe in God, I want you to go outside and tell Bush, one man, one vote. And in other words, hey, Bush, you don't want to start this war all over again against the people who stood back and watched you invade and get rid of Saddam for them, do you? And Bush, of course, said, no, I don't. I can't. Right. So now what am I going to do? So now instead of creating his own little sock puppet system of chosen people to be in the new government, he essentially was fighting for groups that he could not control and who had a much closer allegiance to Iran the whole time. And in fact, at the end of 2018, the Army finally released, I mean, imagine this, 10 years later, they finally release the Army official history of Iraq War II, which is, hardly complete, but they admit there that the only victor of Iraq War II was Iran. And not that they have total sock puppets that rule in the capital city, but they're best friends. The Supreme Islamic Council and the Dawa Party, these are the guys America's been fighting for all this time. So now, I'm sorry it took so long on that, but I just fascinating to me. And it goes to show the mindset of these guys. Why are we even messing with Saddam anyway? To get at Iran, to break Hezbollah away from Iran. And then also, of course, they were supposed to, with their total, mesmerizing control over the Iraqi Shiites, they were supposed to lord it over the Iranians, that you could live like this too, if only you would overthrow your government for America and install a pro-American government for us there and where.
So I do have one question. Do you think they're stupid, or do you think they just want a disaster?
Oh yeah, no, they're stupid. There's no question about. Yeah, go back and read this stuff. And I mean, they do say, I think it's in Coping with Crumbling States, you'll find a line or two about, well, and if it doesn't work out, at least we have smaller units, political units to deal with over there, something like that. But I think that really is not, I mean, the Yemen plan, if you're really interested in the more berserker theory of this, it's Oded Yemen, Yinon, Oded Yemen. And he wrote this thing in 1981 saying we got to smash all the Arab states into 1,000 pieces. In fact, I haven't read all this myself, but Eric Margolis says that Jacob Zhabatinsky, one of the original more right-wing leaders of the Zionist movement way back in the 19th century, that he had always said that this has to be part of Zionism, is to smash the Arab states into the smallest sized factions of warring tribes that they possibly can to maintain their dominance. And then in the Oded Yemen plan, he gets much more into specifics. And it's completely crazy, by the way. It begins with, the world is turning to darkness. Soviet communism is on the verge of total victory over all of mankind. And the Americans will fall and little Israel will be left alone against the Soviet communist menace. And so, in order to gain dominance in the region, we got to smash all these things. And, 9 years later, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Right. But this is the mindset of the guy who was writing it at the time anyway. It was this craziness. Anyway, as far as the stupidity thing and all of that, if I remember back how this played out, the Bush guys were not happy. When the Ayatollah came out and said, yep, you said democracy and we're cashing that check, buddy, Bush they didn't know what to do. They couldn't do a thing. Except start the war all over again and lose. I mean, at that point, it would have been hopeless. So, but then by the end of 2005, and I really am taking too long on Iraq here. I'm sorry, everybody.
It's fine.
By the end of 2005, Zalmay Khalilzad and Elliot Abrams, who are a couple of important neoconservatives in the Bush government, they basically went on a mission to convince the rest of the boys that we really screwed up and we got to admit it to ourselves so that we can fix it. At the beginning of 2006, Khalilzad, well, first Cheney goes over there. And you know what? I remembered a bunch of stuff about this, but I couldn't find it. And if anybody could find it, please email it to me, because I know that Cheney went to Saudi was it January or February 2006? And you can find that, but I couldn't find any good coverage of it. But I'm sure I read like in-depth explanations of what had happened there that I couldn't find. But I know that Khalilzad went there right on Cheney's heels. And basically this was an apology tour. They were going to Saudi to say, we're really sorry, we screwed up, you're right. And in the Khalilzad, we have a State Department notes of the Khalilzad meeting, thanks to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, the American heroes, even though one of them is Australian. Anyway, the king says, listen, it was always you and us and Saddam against Iran, referring to the 1980s.
Right.
He says, now you've given Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. And by the way, I had a fan of the show from over there tell me that that's no mistake. They have the same idiom as us on a silver platter, only they say golden because, hey, they're the Saudi monarchy, right?
Gotcha.
But otherwise, they use the same platter expression anyway. And you just handed Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. Now, what are you going to do about it? And Khalilzad says, yes, Your Highness, I'm so sorry. Whatever you say is what we're going to do about it. And this is the basis of this. So it's such an important article about this policy. It's, you know, it's the name of the article, but it's the name of the policy. The policy is the Redirection. And the article is by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker magazine. And there's a whole series that goes with it. Preparing the Battlefield, The Coming Wars, and a few others. Read all of Hersh during that time frame anyway. But much of this is all about Iran is next. They just empowered Iran so bad, they got to figure out what to do about it. And in Iraq, they started tilting toward the Sunnis. They said, get rid of the worst Al-Qaeda guys for us, and we'll start arming you guys. Not that they would ever be powerful enough to take on the Shiites. So they're still fighting the Shiites at the same time. But then Cheney and Petraeus tried to pick a fight with Iran and create a pretext for war with Iran during the surge in 2007, which essentially it fell apart because the chiefs told Bush, we don't want to do this. And Bush listened to them instead of Cheney, and the thing fell apart. And also Admiral Fallon, who is the commander of CENTCOM, let it be known publicly that he was just insubordinate and said that we'll bomb Iran over my dead body. It's not going to happen. And then in November of 2007, the CIA put out the national intelligence estimate saying that Iran's not even making nukes anyway. They're not even researching how to make a nuke at this point, much less trying to make one. So we don't have to bomb them, whatever, and completely pull the rug out from under that plan. But Cheney was pushing for strikes against the IRGC in the name of their intervention in Iraq as an excuse to start the war with Iran, which he ended up being denied. Then at the same time, they started backing bin Ladenite groups in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran. And in Iran, they're a group called Jundala, who are a bunch of head chopping, suicide bombing crazies who like kidnapped and murdered military officers and all kinds of stuff. And in Syria, it was Liz Cheney at the State Department, our current most dangerous congresswoman at the State Department, Dick Cheney's daughter, who was in charge of the project to start bankrolling the Muslim Brotherhood there, as well as in Egypt. And this was the beginning of essentially the tilt back toward the Saudis to make up for the mistake of Iraq War II. Now, maybe the way I say this sometimes sounds like I'm oversimplifying a little too much. Like, I don't mean to say that when Obama came into power, that Bush read him a brief called The Redirection, and this is exactly where he picked up in that sense, but close enough, right? I mean, the policy was that and they recognized that we have empowered Iran terribly in Iraq. And so in order to try to make up for that, we got to figure out other ways of weakening Iran, because now we got rid of the one big roadblock on that big land bridge, as they call it, that arc of power from Tehran, now including through Baghdad, Damascus, and on to Beirut, right? So in Syria in 2011, as soon as the Arab Spring got to Syria, they intervened. And I have all the evidences in my book, everyone that I can compile from 2011, which is, I think, 5 solid different sources or 6 solid different sources, saying that America was intervening there already in 2011, the first year of the Arab Spring there. Most people don't count intervention starting until 2012 or even 2013. It was in 2011, from the very beginning, they're doing this. And one of the very first articles, may have been the very first article about this, was by John Hanna, who was one of Dick Cheney's neoconservatives, very close to David Wormser and all these guys in the vice president's office, wrote a piece in foreignpolicy.com saying that Prince Bandar bin Sultan, has the former Saudi ambassador to the United States and suspect in the 9/11 attacks to some degree or another, frankly, is now, and who had been the Reaganites' partner in the 80s, backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan way back then, that he is now already, this is in April 2011, he is now sending Mujahideen off to fight in in Syria in a replication. He makes the direct analogy to the war in Afghanistan of the Ronald Reagan years. And so that's how you knew that no matter what, all the hype about peaceful protesters being shot down by the dictator and whatever that, no, this is a CIA FS job right here, dude. This is not helping people. When the Saudis are sending bin Ladenite suicide bomber terrorists, this is not a pro-democracy peaceful protest anymore, right?
Right.
These guys make Antifa look like your babysitter. You know, these guys are fine.
Yeah.
And so and then Eric Margulies told us by November that you have all different NATO countries are involved, and as well as the Jordanians, the Saudis, and the Qataris are all helping build these forces up in Lebanon and sneak them across the border. And then, you know, from 2012, we knew the Jordanians and the Turks were involved and all these things. And even the New York Times was admitting that essentially, even though the Americans are trying to vet moderate groups to receive the arms to fight against Assad, that really they're going to the extremist jihadists. It turns out that, remember when I talked about in 2007, when the redirection started and they started tilting toward the Sunnis in Iraq after fighting pretty much the whole war already for the Shiites and giving them the capital city and everything. When they started turning toward the Sunnis, part of the deal was, and they were already doing this, by the way, the Sunni tribes, I talk about in the book, the Sunni tribes have been turning on the Al-Qaeda guys from the beginning of 06 on, at late 05, beginning of 06. They were sick and tired of a bunch of Saudis and Egyptians and Syrians telling them what to do when they're not from around these parts anyway. And so they started killing them off. Then Petraeus showed up at the beginning of 07 and got at the head of that parade and claimed all the credit for it, but did pay them money and give them weapons. If you'll only kill off these Al-Qaeda guys for us, finish the job of killing off these Al-Qaeda guys for us. And I got to tell you, in that war, I mean, they must have created tens of thousands, 10,000 bin Ladenites in that war. And then the local Sunni population that they were allied with killed them for us. That's a miracle. That's a stroke of luck. I mean, George W. Bush turned Western Iraq into jihadi university, and then the instructors killed their own graduating class and saved the world from them. All right, man, that's good enough for us. Thank God, right? Then what's Obama do? Obama comes in with the defibrillators and brings them right back to life again, and saves this tiny little marginal group, gives them a giant new mission, a giant new battlefield just across the border in Syria. And it was obvious from the beginning. We knew from the beginning that there are Iraqi Sunni militia, extremist militias coming across to join the fight. This news was coming out in 2011. From the very beginning, we knew that was happening. And by January, well, by the end of 2011, or very, very beginning, January 2012, or I think it was December 2011, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, put out, and this is just, this would be 7 months after bin Laden's death. And now Zawahiri's the leader of Al-Qaeda, and he puts out a thing endorsing the revolution in Syria and saying all good Muslim jihadists, bin Ladenites, ought to go there to fight. And Hillary Clinton admits that she knows that by February 2012. She quotes it, and this is the famous State Department document. Link it in your show notes. Hey, look, boss, AQ is on our side in Syria. And that's from Jake Sullivan, who is now Joe Biden's national security advisor, was her right-hand man at the State Department at the time, and wrote that in a memo. Didn't come from WikiLeaks. It was released by the State Department, but it's on wikileaks.org. They kept them all there for us. And you can find that. AQ is on our side in Syria, from Jake Sullivan to Hillary Clinton. She cites that email on CBS News 2 weeks later when the CBS News reporter says, why aren't we doing more? She says, well, look, Ayman al-Zawahiri has endorsed the revolution in Syria. Are we supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria? And that's her excuse to not do more. She's defending Obama's position, but we know she spent the rest of that year wanting him to do more, to back these guys, even though it was clear. And even David Sanger, of all people, in the New York Times, ran a piece in October 2012 that said the jihadists are getting all the guns and doing all the fighting. I just interviewed a guy. You're going to trip when you hear this interview of Martin Smith about Jolani, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, that's coming out on Sunday on my radio show in Los Angeles. It's crazy. The stuff in there. But
I just want to just to recap on what you were just
Yeah.
describing, just so everyone gets it. We always hear is that ISIS formed because we pulled out of Iraq too fast, and that's not what happened. we
Right.
armed
Well, it
ISIS.
partially is. Okay, so there's a kernel of truth in that, right? So,
Uh,
and I'm sorry I'm taking so dang long here, Reed, to get to it. So here's the point. Sanger admits that, and this is what I was saying about Martin Smith. We talk about this. Money and guns and fighters are fungible, right? And on a battlefield like this, where you have 150 different bin Ladenite militias of different names and different descriptions, the money and the guns and the fighters, the most effective fighters, they gravitate to the most extreme groups. And the most extreme groups are the ones who do most of the fighting because they're the ones who don't mind dying, right? They're the most committed guys. So Hillary wants to pretend there's this army of moderates that can somehow take on the jihadists and take on the Ba'athist government there, their Hezbollah and Iranian allies and everybody else. But that's just not true. And it's clear, again, from the very beginning that the guys who are the most powerful force on the battlefield are the al-Nusra Front, which is, as Hillary Clinton's own State Department admitted, and guess what? It was Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, the guy who lied us into war. Him and Bill Kristol were two of the most powerful neoconservatives outside the government pushing for this war. And it was his wife who admitted that actually, Jabhat al-Nusra is just an alias for al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. That's all they are. And so, and they knew that. And then they kept it up and they kept it up. Then in the spring of 2013, ISIS and al-Nusra split. Now, ISIS was really just al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was their new name. They had changed their name from al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic State of Iraq back in 2006. Now they had just added and the Levant onto the end. That was all, meaning Syria and eventually Lebanon and Palestine. Yeah, right. But anyway, and so they were more focused on, except for holding the territory that they already had in the west of the country, they were more focused on consolidating Syria's east and creating a state there. And it's important, it's kind of a side issue, but in bin Ladenite ideology, one of the reasons they attacked the United States was because the theory was there's no point in waging a local revolution against the tyranny in Saudi, in Egypt or Jordan or any of these other countries, Iraq for that matter, and trying to create their bin Ladenite caliphate that they wanted to have, as long as the Americans were around as the superpower and the dominant power in the region, standing behind all the dictatorships, we would just come and bomb their caliphate off the face of the earth again. So the idea was drag us in, bog us down, bleed us to bankruptcy, and force us out the long and the hard way, the same way that we had helped them do to the Soviet Union in the 1980s in Afghanistan. And to replicate that, only then can they wage the revolutions. I would note there were only 400 of these guys in 2001. They could have never waged a successful revolution of any kind in any of these countries anyway. There were 400 men in exile on the Afghan-Pakistan border, for Christ's sake. But so now Baghdadi says, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq says, I want my caliphate now. I don't want to wait around. And so he rolls in June of 2014, he rolls into Western Iraq, seizes Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, Tikrit, and declares the divinely ordained caliphate and says his name is now the Caliph Ibrahim. And this is all, the bin Ladenite absolute dream come true. And so it is true in a kernel of truth, partial crumb of a little bit of a half of a statement, but would count as perjury in court, that leaving Iraq is what caused the rise of ISIS. You swore when you got up on the stand to tell the whole truth. The whole truth is supporting the terrorists in Syria and also, yes, leaving Western Iraq wide open for their taking helped lead to the rise of the caliphate. And in fact, Donald Trump got this right in the campaign, parroting then his national security advisor, Mike Flynn, who had been the head of the DIA during this and had been insubordinate and had been passing intelligence to the Germans to pass to Assad to use to kill the CIA's al-Qaeda guys. How do you like that? And he got fired for that when Seymour Hersh wrote about it. It was called Military to Military is the article if you want to read it. But anyway, Mike Flynn was telling Trump, and Trump said, you can read this. In fact, he said this numerous times in the campaign, but the best version is in his written speech. It's his statement, that the speech that he gave at the National Interest Foundation in 2016, where Zalmay Khalilzad introduced him. It's just amazing how Khalilzad just pops up over and over and over and over again during all these things. But Khalilzad introduces him, and he gets up there and he goes, Obama, remember he said this in the campaign? Obama's the founder of ISIS. Obama and Hillary, they founded ISIS. Well, he gets up there and he says that in a speech, not just off the cuff. In a speech, he goes, Obama's the founder of ISIS. Here's how he did it. First, he backed the jihadists in Libya. Then he backed the jihadists in Syria. And then he pulled all the troops out of Iraq. So there's no one to keep them out of Iraq. And so that was true, right? Then they got rid of Flynn, and they got rid of the first two parts of his syllogism there. And it ended up being, you know how he created ISIS? He pulled out of Iraq. And then by August of 17, he says, we have to stay in Syria. I mean, we have to stay in Afghanistan, because you saw what happened when Obama left Iraq. It led to ISIS. So now wherever we are, we have to stay, or else ISIS is the lesson. And never mind that it was Obama's high treason in league with David Petraeus and Leon Panetta, and of course, John Brennan and Hillary Clinton, to back the bad guys from the last war. I mean, we still had troops in Iraq through the end of 2011, and Obama's already committing treason, backing Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria, by, going along with the Saudis by summer on this. And so then, after they invaded and conquered Iraq, Western Iraq in 2014, then Obama had to launch Iraq War III, where he took the side of the Iraqi Shiite government and Shiite Iraqi army and the Shiite militias backed by Iran, the same ones they wish they hadn't fought Iraq War II for. They fought another war for them in order to destroy the Islamic State Caliphate, smash them and roust them out of Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, Tikrit, and etc. And so another, 100,000 people killed in that air war, something like that, to drive them out of Western Iraq. And then they had to lie. They couldn't admit that they were wrong in Syria. So they kept backing, not ISIS, but Saudi and Turkey were. And the Americans kept backing Al-Qaeda. And the al-Nusra and what they called the Army of Conquest, al-Nusra's alliance with Arar al-Sham and a few of these other groups in taking the Idlib province. And so they couldn't just admit, we shouldn't have done this. Let's go ahead and call off all support for the terrorists and let Assad and Iran and Hezbollah and Russia finish the job of rousting these guys out and recreating their monopoly on violence. Nope, they couldn't do that. So they would only ally with the Syrian Kurds to fight the Islamic State in Syria's east, while essentially the Turks, I mean, I don't know exactly how free Erdogan's will is on this and how much agreement he has with the Americans on this, but Erdogan's Turkey is protecting these Al-Qaeda guys still in the Idlib province. And then the Americans occupy now, and I should have said, sorry, Iraq War III, including Eastern Syria to destroy the caliphate, that lasted from August 14 through the end of 17, the end of Trump's first year in power. The caliphate was destroyed, as Trump put it. The territorial caliphate is gone. Now there's nothing left but remnants of fighters running around, and we don't need to stay for that. But he was overruled by his government. Our troops are still there. You might remember he really did try to get us out in 2018 and in 2019, and was simply overruled by the permanent state. And then, so what are they doing? And how do they convince him really to give in? Because he did give in. And how do they convince him? Iran. Yeah. Guess what? Iran has more influence in Syria than ever before, because they were friends, but now Syria is dependent on Iran. And then, so what do these clowns do? They occupy all the oil fields and wheat fields in the east in order to keep the oil, i.e. money, and the wheat, bread, out of the hands and the mouths of the Syrian people in order to weaken this regime. And as they admit, and I should go back and find my footnote on this before it's lost forever, but I know I read the Trump people saying this without irony, that, yeah, actually, we like the fact that this makes them more financially dependent on Iran because we have this maximum pressure sanctions policy against Iran too. And they can't afford to carry the Syrians around on their back. So this is helping. Now, this whole war was fought to try to break Syria away from Iran. Now they're more dependent on them forever than ever before. And the Americans say, yeah, that's what we were trying to do. And that's why we're occupying the wheat and oil fields now, is to make that even more the case, while people are starving and dying.
Yeah.
You know, while the sick die when they otherwise would have lived, and the people who would have been healthy are now sick. And it's the kind of thing where if the rest of the world was outlawing trade with the United States, we'd start launching H-bombs. Are you kidding me? You're going to put sanctions on the USA? We're going to put an H-bomb on you, would cry Washington, D.C. But they will put, and sanctions is such a euphemism too. This is siege warfare is what it is. They do it through international law, where shipping companies, they don't have to break a naval blockade. They just wouldn't dare dream of crossing the U.S. Treasury Department that can cancel all their bank accounts anywhere in the world, right? So any shipping company would just skip the port. You don't even have to have a naval blockade. It's all virtual, but through so-called international law, and just through America's weight as the 800-pound gorilla that, hey, Germans, would you rather do business with Iran or would you rather do business with the United States of America? Make your pick. There's no choice, right? But they have to choose. And so, of course, they choose us, because you're talking zillions versus low billions. Right. So then why did Biden bomb Iraqis in Syria a couple of weeks ago? Well, rewind. A year ago, Donald Trump was in the same position. Donald Trump bombed the Iranian Quds Force general, Qasem Soleimani, and the leader of an Iraqi militia, the leader of the Kataib Hezbollah militia in Iraq, and almost caused a war. Luckily, the Ayatollah launched a volley of missiles at the empty corner of an American airbase, and Trump let him have the last word and refused to take us to war, thank God. But it could have been much worse. He should have never been messing around at all. But what precipitated that was that on December 27th, 2019, somebody fired some rockets at an American base and killed, I think, one contractor there. Same thing as this time. And then they just blamed this group, Kataib Hezbollah, which they say with credibility is backed by Iran. As I said, their leader was killed with Soleimani in that drone strike at the Baghdad airport. So pretty credible accusation that they're very closely tied there. Fine. But there's no real proof that Kataib Hezbollah had done that attack. And I already knew this anyway and was already, talking about it. But then I interviewed an Iraqi journalist who agreed that ISIS has just as much access to that territory. In fact, the New York Times ran a piece that said, anybody could have fired these rockets, man. And if ISIS was smart, and sometimes they are, again, ISIS just means Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Zarqawi's group from Iraq War II, Baghdadi's group from Iraq War III. If they were smart, they might launch rockets in a way to try to frame up a Shiite militia backed by Iran in order to divide their worst enemies who happen to hate each other, right? So America and Iran are there fighting ISIS, not together, but we're both allied with the Iraqi army that's fighting ISIS with them. So if you're ISIS, you'd be crazy to not do a stunt like this in order to try to provoke a conflict between the Americans and the Iranians. Well, the same thing happened again. Just a few weeks ago, somebody fired some rockets from the back of a pickup truck at the airport in Erbil in northern Iraqi Kurdistan and killed a contractor working for the American coalition there and wounded a couple of Americans, including a guardsman, I think it was. And so then in retaliation, 10 days later, Joe Biden launches an attack on a different Shiite militia at a border crossing just on the Syrian side of the line. But another militia that also supposedly is backed by Iran, even though the New York Times admitted that intelligence officials admitted that they don't know if these guys are backed by Iran at all or not. But anyway, and they just bombed them in order to essentially, not to spin for Biden here, Reed, but clearly what was going on there with the diplomatic language was he had to do something. And this was the most minimal thing he could do. He could bomb Iran. He could bomb Iranians in Iraq. He could bomb Iranian loyal militias in Iraq, or Iranian backed militias in Iraq, or he could bomb an Iranian backed militia in Syria, an Iranian backed Iraqi militia in Syria. So he went for that one with the hope that the Ayatollah would let him have the last word and let it be, at that was what he was trying to do there. So people did freak out like, oh my God, we're bombing Syria. You know what? We're bombing Iraq all the time. We're bombing ISIS guys in Iraq. We still have, air wars going on in Afghanistan to a certain degree, where they're actually helping the Taliban fight the Islamic State there. And we still have air wars, of course, going on in Somalia. And we still have the naval blockade going on in Yemen, which might as well be an atom bomb. The UN says 400,000 children are going to starve to death this year if Joe Biden doesn't lift the goddamn blockade. So what's the difference there? So, again, not to spin for the guy, but I don't think he was looking for a real escalation in Syria. At the same time, he ain't leaving. Mm-hmm. And I don't see any pressure inside the establishment in any important place that says we got to get out of Syria and Iraq. If that's going to happen in the Joe Biden years, it's going to be because you and me and the anti-war movement of America absolutely insist and absolutely will not take no for an answer. Otherwise, that's it. Everyone in the consensus, in the media, in the think tanks, in the political parties, in, all the groups in power there, they hate Iran and the Shiites more. They're willing to back bin Ladenite terrorists against them if they have to. Hell, even just when they feel like it, because they hate them that much more than our enemies, Al Qaeda, who have shed American blood. And so they're willing to keep this thing going. And see, they can't, just like we started this with the clean break, they can't attack Iran. It's too big. They're trying to figure out a way. They can't do a 1953 CIA coup. They can't do a Normandy invasion and lose an entire army and Marine Corps trying to seize Persia with force. They can't launch an effective air war without a ground invasion, because you need special operations guys on the ground with laser designators to take out the anti-aircraft at a minimum. And the Iranians have the ability to hit back in a way where we have assets totally exposed in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Kuwait, and especially in Qatar and Bahrain, where we have the massive Central Command headquarters in Qatar and the air base there and the 5th Fleet station at Bahrain. And then, of course, all the economic targets all the way up and down the Gulf and bases in Saudi and UAE and whatever. And so in a real war with Iran, of course, America could B-52 carpet bomb the place off the face of the earth eventually and win. Not much question to that, but at an absolutely heavy price. And they know that it's too high of a price to pay. And so they're always trying to figure out what can we do to spite these guys without actually letting it escalate all the way to a war. And so that was why Trump admitted that, look, that's why we have to stay in Syria, Iran. Sometimes they remember to mention ISIS. A lot of times they don't even remember to mention ISIS. A lot of times they'll be like, oh yeah, and also ISIS. Did I say ISIS? Yeah, but no. And Trump said, why are we there? Because to keep an eye on Iran. That's what he said. We have to keep our eye on Iran by keeping bases in Iraq. Nonsense, And in other words, then our alliance with the Iraqi government in our mopping up exercise against ISIS is just cover for, eventual conflict, possibly, probably, with the Iraqi government's other allies on the other side.
Yeah. Well, I know you got to get going, Scott. That you didn't make me work very hard in that. That was pretty easy. I just basically said Syria, go, and you laid it all.
Did I
out.
answer what you were wondering about?
Oh yeah, no, that was perfect. I want everyone who follows me to go follow you. Go follow Scott, guys. Follow him at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute. He's got the Scott Horton Show, and he's got a new book out. Enough already, Time to End the War on Terror. So I've got a few other truck drivers like myself who are eagerly waiting for the audiobook. So when's the audiobook coming out? When can we expect that?
Man, I'm so sorry about that. I am spending so much time just signing books and packing them up and shipping them is like all of my free time now, because there's so many donors and so many media people and interviewees of mine, friends of mine. I want to try to send them all to peace groups and radio stations and all these things. And it's just really difficult to record an audiobook, in my experience, if I don't have like 10 hours in a row that I can sit down, kick everybody else out of the house, and really sit and be alone and really work and knock out large portions of it at a time. If I'm trying to get it done 20 minutes at a time and an hour at a time, it's just never going to get done that way. But then what ends up happening is I end up kicking the can down the road and kicking it down the road until someday I have a few real full days to record the thing. And lucky I have somebody to help me edit it this time. But man, I'll tell you what, recording an audiobook sucks. I did one for Lou Rockwell. And then I did Fool's Errand, and it's so difficult. I mean, I've heard people say they knock them out no problem. Maybe if you have a real producer on the other side of the glass who can help you do it perfect the first try through kind of thing, delete all the bad takes and keep only the good ones so you don't have to go back and edit the whole thing for months. You know, I don't know. But when I did Fool's Errand, it took me half a year, dude. It took me half a year to get it all the way recorded and all the way nitpicked to death and ready to publish. So I don't know. I don't know what that means for enough already. I hope it ain't that bad. I really want to try to get to it soon. But I apologize to the guys.
I wouldn't be able to listen to it in anybody else's voice. I'd have to have your emphasis, and you know, if you had someone else do it, it just wouldn't work. So
I think so too. You know, I've had people try to volunteer for it, and I keep brushing them off. That I think it's to get the sentences enunciated the way I want them. I got to be the one doing it, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what? You just have to read it on the weekends, man. At night when you're going to sleep. And you have nightmares all night.
I'll probably just have to get a hard copy because I got to get a bookshelf behind me like you and Dave. You know, I just don't look very good with a fake background all the time.
That's a cool logo, man.
Yeah, it's fan made, so it's cool. But
you could just have big old speakers there, man. There ain't nothing wrong with audiobooks, you know.
Yeah, I like that. Well, thanks, Scott. We'll have to do it again. And I really appreciate the work you do. You're the guy I listen to on foreign policy, so keep up the good work, and lots of us appreciate you.
Oh yeah, thanks very much, Reed. Happy to be here.